Right. Well, good morning. It is Friday, April 26th. Welcome to this edition of America Through the Eyes of Daniel Moss, opinion columnist at Bloomberg, someone who I've known and admired for quite a while, and I've been in Singapore for a long time. So thank you, Daniel, for joining us. It's been really a pleasure to read your column all this while on Bloomberg. You're so well known. So it's such a privilege for us to have folks in the room live for the first time and to have you live in the room with me. The reason why we started this series, as I've explained before, is because as I go about doing my job at AmCham, people love to give me their opinion about what they think of the United States. And many times I'm like, what's your stake in this? But you know what? Everybody has an opinion because everybody cares what the United States of America does because there's an impact. So I thought, what better way to understand and get feedback about America than from different folks with different lenses so that we can learn and possibly improve how we do things, how we think about things, and not be the obnoxious, arrogant American in the room all the time, because we're learning and we're open to feedback and opinions. And that's why we have Daniel with us today. And as you know, he focuses on Asian economies, but actually has global experience. And so that's what we're going to hear about from him today. And just to let the audience know, we are going to start the first half of this engagement on LinkedIn Live. But after the first half, we will go off of LinkedIn Live into a private discussion with Daniel via Zoom. So you are still welcome to go ahead and register so you can join the private conversation after the first half of this session. So we're going to start off with welcoming Daniel and asking you to go ahead and, it's free and open for you to think, just like free speech in America. You can tell us what you think. Give us a little background about your connection to the US, because when you open your mouth, people will know that you probably didn't grow up in the US, but you do have a very strong link to the US. So tell us about your connection and then kind of move into what you think about the United States.
Sure, out of many, one, right? Thanks, Hsien. It's really great to be here, and we are on the record. And I'll just clear my throat at the start by saying that the opinions I express here are my own, and they don't represent the views of Bloomberg LP or of its editorial board. So having said that, it's terrific to be here. Thank you. Yes, you're right. I do not sound like an American, but I am. I took the oath in early 2016, and I'm proud of my adopted country, just as I love my native country, Australia. And Hsien, you and I sit on the board of the American Association of Singapore. There's some folks from that august body on the line today, and I'm really happy to contribute. So I've been living in Singapore since 2019. This was a return to Southeast Asia for me, but not a return to Singapore. First time living in Singapore. I joined Bloomberg almost 30 years ago. 30 years ago in June. In Sydney, we were a small operation, very scrappy, sitting around in our underwear, doing many tasks. If you walked into the Sydney office, if you walked into the Sydney office today, you might wonder what all these people are doing, but there were just a few of us. An opportunity came up to go to KL to succeed a colleague who'd moved on, and put me in coach. I would love that. So that was my first experience, working in South. And, I look back on my time in KL, different from Singapore, but certainly sharing a similar regional orientation. I see it as like, a really special time in my life and my career, because from 96 to 98, there was a whirlwind there, as there was elsewhere in the region. And I saw, the last year of the boom and at least the start of the bust. So I then went to DC for a short while before I was asked to return to Asia. I was in Japan for a couple of years. Then in London for 5, running our global foreign exchange news. I was asked to return to DC in 2006, where I stayed for 10 years. I managed economics and international government coverage. I then moved to New York to be with my wife, Joanna. And that was great. And since 2019, here in Singapore.
That's quite a journey. Were you always thinking that these are the places you wanted to go? Were there other places where you feel that you should have spent more time? And of course, because it is America through the eyes of Daniel Moss, maybe tell us a little bit about how America was perceived in those times and places when you were traveling around.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on where you are and what's going on at the time. So if you take the late 90s, America, very cool. .com boom, the new paradigm, and it was just cool.
I'm asked to speak a little bit closer.
Sure. And it was very aspirational, and there was a sense of something special was going on. If you looked past the blue dress, there was a lot going on. And you also saw the impact of a very strong US currency and an extremely strong US economy at that point. There were quite a lot of global imbalances. When I went to Kale, it was very much, Asian values, the Asian way. Look at these stratospheric rates of growth. And then it collapsed for a couple of years. And some countries did it harder than others. But I had a revelation. I was sitting in a sushi bar in KL with the chief economist of a large Japanese investment bank. We were talking about the ringgit's decline and the deteriorating economic picture. Of course, it became much worse. And the guy looked at me, he said, Daniel, there's not going to be a recession in Malaysia. It's not going to happen. I said, well, but I don't understand. Why not? He said, because Mahathir won't let it happen. And I thought, okay, well, there's a disconnect here. What happens when assumptions get taken apart? And then we saw the region go into fast forward from July 1997 through to the start of 1999. Living in London in the early 2000s, you saw, a different side of America. The invasion of Iraq, in which the UK was a participant, as was Australia, was enormously contentious and very unpopular. I had a job managing foreign exchange news. This was the early years of the euro. The dollar was having a couple of down years. People obsessed about the twin deficits. George W. Bush was not a particularly popular person in Europe, though looks like a statesman in retrospect. I was then asked to return to DC in 2006. So caught the start of the 2008 wave. All of a sudden, America was cool again. And then some difficulties set in. And then we had the early 2000s, the jobless recovery, sclerosis. Although you look back on that period and you see actually that was the longest period of expansion the United States ever enjoyed. So, what I've learned is that sentiment, comes and goes. What does remain is resilience, a commitment to trying to get it right, though we all sometimes fall short of that. Great nations can fall short of that as well. So for me, America has been about aspiration and resilience. I'm not naive about where we sometimes come up short. But at the end of the day, I do believe, certainly economically and in many other aspects, it is the indispensable nation. Not flawless, but at the end of the day, indispensable.
That's a pretty strong characterization of the US as being indispensable, because there's certainly other countries who think that we could probably step aside a bit and maybe let others lead once in a while. Do you think that's a possibility? Because, well, I'm not very good with history like you are, but if I understand, particularly since World War II, the US has been indispensable, but the world is different now. So can other countries, and I'm not gonna, look, I might as well name the country, but you can all picture it in your head, but can other countries actually step up to be a leader?
Sure, they can step up to be a leader. By indispensable, I mean, you really can't subtract it from any equation. There are things that the US economy and only the US economy and financial power can contribute. It doesn't mean we're the only contributor by any stretch of the imagination. Many Americans sometimes wish we could take a break. But there are things that require American commitment that won't happen without it. And there are other things where it sometimes seems like we're along for the ride. You know, it's a big world, Shan. You know, no one has to dominate. There is no monopoly on wisdom, but at the end of the day, there are some places you just can't get without America. And that's really the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of people are nodding their heads right now. So yesterday, this whole week, we've had a US congressional delegation visiting Singapore. And as they do, and I really love it when our US representatives come to different countries, different parts of the world, because we all know that Washington is a bit of an echo chamber. And we can say that no matter where we live, that's where you are. So you cannot help but be surrounded by wherever you happen to be. So to some extent, I really have to applaud them for pulling themselves out of their comfort zone and coming to Singapore and wanting to learn more about the region. So this congressional delegation, which you'll see in the news because there's too many people I need to name, but you know, I was really impressed with them because when you read about it in the news, and most of these congressional delegations are bipartisan, so they will have Democrats and Republicans all joining together to take this trip together. They were very collegial. And they were very open and they were sharing and they were supporting each other. And, you know, I think that clearly there are some disagreements in ideology and whatnot, but it didn't come through, at least in the engagement they had with AmCham. But one of the things that was discussed, which we had talked about earlier, was that in Washington, when they talk about, for example, the strength of the US dollar, it is not what they're hearing out here. Out here, as you've been writing about for a long time, as we look at, and I mean, make sure I get this right, US as the global reserve currency, there's a different conversation that we're having out here than what they're thinking about in Washington. There's a real fear in Washington, from what I understand, that the US dollar is not doing as well as it appears to be out here, that is not a strong dollar, that this global reserve currency is going to go away. So since you're an expert in this, can you give us some insight into why is Washington thinking this way? Why are they so fearful when out here it's a completely different story?
Yeah, I should caveat the remark I made earlier. It's the premier global reserve currency. There's about 5 currencies that are generally considered blessed by the IMF to have global reserve status. The US is by far the leader of that group of about 5. You've got the euro, British pound, Japanese yen, Chinese yuan.
Okay. So what's going on with these folks in Washington? It seems that they're talking about something quite different than what they're hearing out here.
Well, you're right about the echo chamber thing. You know, I lived in the DC area for 10 years, worked in the bureau there for 10 years. It is a big echo chamber. So look, when you're inside of something, you know, it's sometimes, you know, hard to see, you know, the broader picture, you know, and look, it's an election year. We're in a hyper-partisan environment. I'll just say this, you know, it's important to remember that although inflation has come down from the levels it was at in, say, 2022, it's still high relative to where it's been over the past few decades. So it doesn't feel like your dollar's going particularly far. The other thing is people will also look at US assets that feel like they're beaten up because they feel beaten up. But it's not necessarily the same thing. I mean, it's funny, you know, I was talking with my wife, Joanna, last night. We were reminiscing about when we lived in Brooklyn, so we could go to Heights Cafe on Montague Street, have a couple of martinis, a decent meal, some dessert, coffee, a nightcap for, you know, $150. Now, try having more than a couple of lattes in some other places for that amount. So, you know, you need to take these things into consideration. But look, over a very short-term perspective, the dollar was not supposed to be this strong this year. This was supposed to be the year of the big pullback. Hasn't happened. The opposite's occurred. And it's causing, you know, a tremendous deal of anxiety among policymakers in Asia, not just Asia. You know, a column I published this morning about how Indonesia wrestles with this. Always very big emerging market, massive economy in Southeast Asia. By the way, never gets credit for that, but very, very attuned because of the trauma of 1998 about what the rupee is up to. Now, when they shocked everyone by raising interest rates this week, if you listen to the central bank governor there, it had very little, almost nothing to do with domestic economic conditions. It was all about the dollar and the rupee. You know, there was an infamous economist, I consider it infamous, they probably think it's great, front page story in The Economist, late 2004, early 2005. And the premise of the headline was basically, you know, the end of the dollar. Okay, I say 2005, dollar had a great year. And now here we are. The euro's ascent amid much hoopla at the start of this century, it really stalled. The Eurozone ran into a series of debt crises. The contradiction between having a common currency but not a common fiscal policy became all too apparent. And people say, oh, you know, the dollar's share of global reserves is, you know, down below whatever level. But you've got to remember, it's been steady at about 60% for a great deal of time now. And the next closest one is the euro, which is like hovering at around 20% and has stalled. I remember late one Friday night in 2015 when the IMF blessed the Chinese yuan with global reserve currency status. That was back in the day when China's ascent seemed pretty much unstoppable. But if you look at it, the economy of China was already on a long-term glide path toward a much slower, more sustainable pace of growth. It was like, here comes the yuan challenging the dollar. But, you know, the global reserve data published by the IMF, SWIFT transaction records, a bunch of other things, suggest China's share of that is very, very small. And it's growing for sure, but it's still very small. So I think, you know, we need some perspective in these discussions. You know, a lot of it's in the eye of the beholder, but there is sufficient hard data out there to suggest that, you know, for folks like those on your Codel this week, you know, they can chill down a little bit about this. US dollar's not going anywhere.
I guess the question is, I had two questions, but they were coming at it from different angles. One question about the Chinese yuan was, you know, what can China do to make it a much more prominent global reserve currency since they're at such a small fraction now? But the opposite side of the question is more, and this sounds really contentious, so I'm just going to say it, is if we were so inclined to keep them down, right, and to ensure that the US dollar stays at 60% or even better, what would someone do, or what would a country want to do to keep the Chinese yuan down? You see, it's like one's positive and one's negative.
So firstly, I mean, I don't see it as in, you know, my interest or the global interest for any country to be, you know, kept down.
Okay.
It's not a very healthy state of affairs. China is, for all its short-term difficulties, second largest economy in the world. It's the largest manufacturer, largest exporter, still the largest this, largest that. You know, and the Chinese economy has made enormous strides, you know, in the past couple of decades. So I'm certainly not interested in keeping anybody down. I'll just make that point.
All right. Well, let me go back to, I'm just going to do a time check here. Well, we have a little bit more time to hear you give us a longer response. And, you know, when I think about your writing, because you've been focusing on Asia, you'll point out, say, for example, the BPO situation in the Philippines and how it's been impacted by AI. And then your latest column today about Indonesia. So when I read your columns, and because I know you, what I'm looking for is what is the relevance of this, or what could be the impact of this on American business, right? So I can take some little bits of insight and share it with my members. Like, this thing is happening in Philippines, this thing is happening in Vietnam, but this is what you need to know to be able to adjust what you're doing from a business perspective. So we're thinking about all the countries that you write about. which country do you think has the potential to have the biggest impact on businesses that operate with headquarters in the US?
So I think, the starting point for that has to be, what are the largest economies in Asia and what is the degree of integration with the US economy, US capital markets, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to start with the big guys, some of whom enjoy a close strategic partnership with the United States. Others, have a more complicated and difficult relationship. I think one of the things that is the most interesting in the past year has been the dramatic swing in perspective regarding Japan and China. A dominant theme, of our reporting and writing, and not just ours this year, has been this perception that Japan is back. Now, what long-term residents of Japan and what Japanese folks would say, back? Look, we never went anywhere. But, Japan is cool. So, in the early 90s, even though, Japan's bubble economy had popped, there was still a view that Japan was, look, I'll just come back to a point you made at the start. Declinism has been rife throughout US history, and fear of decline and fear of the US losing its pinnacle has been a dominant theme right the way through. Look, Eisenhower, Kennedy, it's nothing new. Oh my God, we're going to fall behind on the bomb. We're going to fall behind on the space race. We'll fall behind on this and that. So there's nothing particularly new about that.
Yeah, we got strong FOMO going.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been some acidification, some toxication of it, but there's nothing new at its core. And then by the late 90s, there was a perception that, Japan was kind of washed up, and you hear a lot about, the lost decades. And then folks would visit Japan from outside and say, expected to see, soup kitchens, folks lying in the park. No, absolutely not.
Well, you do get salarymen who like to pee against lampposts at night. Does that count? No.
I think it depends where they're doing it.
Okay.
But Japan doesn't seem to be back. Look, the Nikkei is back. It's surpassed its peak of late 1989. Japan's cultural power, its soft power, notwithstanding Korea's advances in that area, is as strong as ever. The Japanese strategic relationship with the United States, always close since 1945, is getting a whole lot closer. And look, Tokyo is also a fun place to be.
I prefer Nagoya. I lived there for 5 years, so I'm just going to do a shout out to all my friends from Nagoya.
Did you work in the auto industry?
No, but close enough. I live down the street from the Toyotas. Yeah.
Oh, well, you hang out in some tiny neighborhoods, don't you? But actually, that's a really good point. So, I talked about, Malaysia, and I thought that was a great time to be there, cut my teeth and all that sort of thing. But, if I were to have regrets about any of these assignments, it would be the 2 years I spent in Japan. I just didn't make the most of it. And it was not a particularly happy time, late 90s. Japan was coming to grips with a changing role in the world. There was a sense that the problems in the banking industry had yet to really flush out. And, I made the mistake in retrospect of spending too much time in sort of expat ghettos around Nishiazabu and Shibuya and the old Roppongi, not the new shiny one. And so I look back on that with a very real sense of regret. So actually, my wife and I went on our honeymoon in 2016 to Japan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I made amends there. But perceptions have changed. Japan, all of a sudden, Japan's cool now. Japan's back, never really left, but it's back anyway. And China's pushed up. So it's easy to latch on to these sort of big picture narratives, which they're easy to understand, and they help you sort the world and sort events into neat boxes, or at least some sort of cylindrical container, right? But you get the gratification of a broad macro picture, but you can also forget sometimes that that macro picture is comprised of lots of microclimates, and lots of smaller pictures. You know, if you piece those together a certain way from the bottom up rather than from the top down, you know, you can come to a more nuanced picture. You know, Japan was never as washed up as it was made to look or sometimes portrayed. And China's not as down now as it sometimes seems. You know, sort of, I don't know why we have to swing between these extremes. And I sort of see, you know, part of my job as, you know, redressing some of these extreme swings in opinion and just like challenging readers gently and respectfully. You know, there's another way of looking at this. Have you thought about interpreting it this way? You know, here's another route.
Yeah. No, and that's exactly what we need, which is why we're having this conversation, so we can get a different perspective that challenges some of the assumptions that we're constantly making about various countries that surround us. Well, going back to the US again, sorry. You know, again, with the Codell conversation yesterday, they're fully aware that the world wants to see a US commitment, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. That is one of the reasons why President Biden, you know, devised the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. They want, you know, folks here want to see, demonstrate your commitment, but it isn't just on the military side, the defense side. There is a desire for the US to really engage economically. And there's certain degree of, you know, dissatisfaction with the engagement. What is your take on the US involvement in the region economically? Because you touched upon trade a little bit, and the US Trade Representative Office has been in the news this week. Even with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, there was dissatisfaction that there was no market access involved. So the trade bit was quite light touch. So on the economic engagement front, what's your take on the US, particularly as perhaps Southeast Asia might perceive it? Because the whole ASEAN as a block thing is also a bit tricky to figure out. How do we develop a relationship between ASEAN and the US? Sorry, it's like 5 questions bundled into one.
Well, let's start with, well, when you say ASEAN,
Yeah.
what do you really mean by ASEAN?
10 countries.
You know, you can hear and read a lot in august op-ed pieces published by other news organizations about the centrality of ASEAN, for instance. No one's really fully explained to me what that means.
Well, everybody likes to say they're the 5th largest economy in the world. And for those of us from California, we're like, California is the 4th largest economy. So what's the big deal? Just kidding.
Yeah, you're your own country. You could be. When is California going to become a member of the G7?
We'll have a little powwow later.
Okay. So it's a great point. I mean, folks living outside Southeast Asia will sometimes say to me, so ASEAN, that's like the EU, right? I'm like, yeah, well, not really, not so much. ASEAN has a common commitment on some issues, but on issues like deep economic integration, the sharing of a regulatory framework, the sharing of a monetary system, these are seen as very sensitive issues of sovereignty. And I find it difficult to foresee anytime soon any substantial surrender within ASEAN of some of those sovereign aspects. You know, certainly the idea of a common antitrust policy, like what? It's not going to happen. You know, a former Indonesian minister once said to me, you know, ASEAN is as much about what it's not as about what it is. So if you go back to the founding of ASEAN in the late 1960s, shortly after the ascent of the New Order regime in Indonesia, and Indonesia's participation was critical, really a group of US-aligned anti-communist Southeast Asian nations. And it was as much about what they weren't as opposed to what they were. So if you tell me if you ask me I'll throw it back to you, but if you ask me what does ASEAN mean to the US, what does ASEAN mean to itself?
No, that's a great question. And then in terms of US engagement in this region economically, do you think that it's good enough? And if not, then what could the US be doing more of?
look, it's a tough question. And I think it's also useful to take a step back and say, what do you mean by the US? Do you mean Corporation X should have built that extra facility in Geelong? Or are you saying, Catherine Tai should really be here more often? What are we really saying here? US corporations are huge investors in Southeast Asia. And I sometimes think there is a tendency to equate what American corporations and American individual businessmen and women are doing, to equate that with the US government. There are countries in Southeast Asia where there is a much stronger commitment to the role of the state in commercial life than Americans have traditionally been comfortable with. So just because, Microsoft wants to do something here, or just because Cisco wants to do something here, or just because, JP Morgan might have plans to do something here. I'm not meaning to single out those fine firms. They're just iconic examples of US corporate presence. Are they necessarily reflecting the goals of the US government? So I think, often, like, you get into an elevator. How many times have you got into an elevator at a hotel and there's been a little screen in the corner that says, and ASEAN accounting for XY% of global GDP? Well, okay, that's great. But I'm right here, right now, and this is a JW Marriott hotel. And I just met someone who works for Morgan Stanley in a cafe. So, like, what are we really talking about here?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I think obviously we're at the American Chamber of Commerce. So we like to talk about how our member companies, which some of which are not American, by the way, but have significant presence in the US, what they're contributing to the region and how that generates opportunities for folks back at home in the United States. I mean, that's kind of the virtuous circle, right? Cycle. But at the same time, when people are thinking about greater US engagement, I think it does come back to the trade conversation, the market access conversations. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, but it's been very low key. And as a community, we would love to be able to celebrate it more vocally, but there hasn't really been as much activity as we would have liked. Granted, it's a bit of a tricky year in the United States with the elections, so understood, trade is a sensitive topic, but end of day, that's what our companies need in order to be successful. So this conversation about trade is an ongoing one. I'm certainly not an expert, and many folks in the room and online with us are, but I'm just gonna leave that out there because there's continuing dissatisfaction on the trade conversation. And as you go about your day, thinking about your next column, and I know you mainly focus on economies and lately a lot on currencies, but the trade bit is a tricky one that people are not happy with. Yeah.
Oh, well, look, that's certainly true. There's always a trade story happening somewhere, and that's an issue that's got great visibility at the moment, particularly when framed in the context of statecraft, economic statecraft, and commercial and strategic rivalry, for sure. And there's a great deal of concern that industry is being ring-fenced in the interests of national security, what that security might look like. So if at your core you believe that freer markets, there's no such thing as a free market, freer markets are better than constrained markets, and that a broadly liberal flow of goods, services, capital, and talent is a good thing, then you've got to be uncomfortable with that.
A little glimpse into the future and what decisions might have to be made. But I think at this point, what we'll do for our audience on LinkedIn, we're going to be transitioning off into our more private conversation. So before we do that, I always like to have a bit of a lighthearted moment to help us with the easing of the transition. So Daniel, you ready for the rapid fire questions?
Sock it to me.
They're going to be hard, Yeah, it's gonna be about, I don't know, something economic. No, I'm kidding. I can't answer.
Can I
ask
get a
this kind of
refill on
question.
the coffee?
You had enough. You ready? What's your favorite American food?
The Whopper.
Oh, I have to tell everybody, I once went into a McDonald's and asked for a Whopper. Okay, sorry. Apology to my friends. Okay, what's your favorite American city?
Denver.
Denver, why? I mean, it's very nice. I'm not saying anything, but we're from California, damn it. No.
My wife was born there.
Aw, so sweet. Okay, now I know you're gonna get the third question right. Yeah. Okay. Who's your favorite American?
Aside from you, Joanna Ossinger.
Aw, so sweet. Heart. Okay, but I have to add on to that. Who do you think is the most interesting American celebrity? I got long to laugh. Interesting, huh? Not like hot or like cute or whatever. Interesting.
Interesting American celebrity. I'll sort of answer this in a slightly different way. So last weekend, sometimes when you come home on a Friday or a Saturday night, you like to replay like constant clips of movies that you think are great. And a favorite for me, I just watched this last weekend, was the cafe scene in Heat, where Pacino and De Niro are on set together for the very first time, and the exchange between them lasts for about 5 minutes. And they are both, it is the epitome of cool. The cafe scene from Heat between De Niro and Pacino.
Okay, good. Thank you for repeating that, because I was like, okay, I must look up what this movie is. So the cafe.
You don't know
scene from-
Heat?
No, okay, now we're gonna end it. I do not know Heat. I will look it up this weekend. Thank you everyone for joining us on LinkedIn Live. We're gonna now transition over to our private conversation on Zoom. See you next time.